If anyone has ever told you a tale that ended with the words, "and though that is the story of the real first Thanksgiving," don't you believe them? The national holiday Thanksgiving developed slowly over decades in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. We know about the first Thanksgiving claimed by the Plymouth colony, a days-long festival in 1621. Then there's the Massachusetts Bay colonies claimed first Thanksgiving. Maine also boasts the first Thanksgiving. Virginia's first Thanksgiving is claimed to have taken place in 1607. It was a service of thanks for the end of what came to be known as the Starving Time, when 490 settlers were reduced to 60 in one ferocious winter. Florida also claims to have held the first Thanksgiving. Theirs dating to Spanish explorers in the 1500s, and you know Texas had to get in on the first Thanksgiving thing too. No one is telling the whole truth, and everybody knows it. The annual celebration of a day of Thanksgiving in the U.S., as I said, grew up slowly and was the source actually at times of a lot of debate. And tucked into that rich history of the American Thanksgiving is an important theological question. The Puritans versus the people, we could call it. In that debate over whether or not to hold an annual day of Thanksgiving and who had the right to declare a day of Thanksgiving is a great lesson for us, I think, as we polish off the last of the leftovers at the end of Thanksgiving weekend. The Puritans weren't convinced it was appropriate to celebrate Thanksgiving. In fact, they weren't sure it was appropriate to celebrate much of anything. The Church of England had broken away from the church in Rome, and the Puritans believed they needed to purify themselves of all things Catholic. Celebration of special seasons was one of those things. So no Christmas celebrations, for example. In fact, workers in early America were fined by the Puritans for taking Christmas Day off. Every day was God's day. No need to be ridiculous and have too much fun. I don't think the Puritans would have been any good at a party. But when it came to Thanksgiving, they had what I believe is a point that's worth at least exploring. They believed a day of Thanksgiving should only be declared for a local area by a local congregation. Some years, they said, it was more appropriate to fast or to mourn than to give thanks. How can we set aside one day per year for giving thanks when we're not sure there will be anything for which to give thanks? Historian Diana Carter Applebaum writes that Judge Samuel Sewall, who had trained for the ministry at Harvard, was very much against an annual day of Thanksgiving. She said Sewall's position against an annual Thanksgiving was shared by many ministers who feared that such yearly celebrations, when no particularly noteworthy beneficences had been received, would make the people overly confident of the Lord's generosity, and of course, in turn, not scared enough of God's wrath. So they said, not the government, only local congregations could declare either days of fast or days of Thanksgiving. Days of Thanksgiving ought to be spent giving thanks for something. And I get it. I do understand the Puritans' position. It was just days before Thanksgiving 6 years ago that my younger brother was killed in an auto accident. The many of us who have experienced loss during this season know that it becomes a time of mixed joy and grief. Yet 2 weeks after Jeremy died, my father stood at the head of the table that Thanksgiving and gave thanks for the blessings of food and family. And even though he confessed he often didn't understand his God's ways, I didn't feel his prayer of thanksgiving. I was with the Puritans. This was not a year for Thanksgiving. A fast would have been more appropriate. But back in the 17th century, the people weren't at all with the Puritans. The Puritans tried, God bless them. They fined young people for playing games on Thanksgiving. They filled the day with worship. Applebaum wrote, morning services, including prayers, hymns, and a sermon, occupied about 4 hours. 1 hour, you're welcome. The congregation then went home to dinner and returned to church for another 2 hours or so of the evening prayers and a final installment of the morning sermon. This pattern of 2 services punctuated by a dinner was modeled on the schedule of the New England Sabbath day. Though very pious, Applebaum concludes, it was probably not very much fun. There were battles over whether governors or ministers could declare Thanksgivings, and there was plenty of other political wrangling. But in the end, the people of New England wouldn't be put off their annual feast. They wanted an annual fall Thanksgiving, a harvest celebration, and they had it. In years of plenty and in years of poverty, they gathered to give thanks for life and food and each other. So here's the question as I see it. Is gratitude a response to circumstances, or is it a practice, a spirit to be cultivated in all times? I told you that in the weeks after my brother died, I didn't feel like joining in my father's Thanksgiving prayer. And yet it didn't take long for gratitude to find me. 2 months before he died, Jeremy and I did something we didn't often do. We sat in a spot we both loved and we talked about important things. Family and politics and healthcare reform. He was a healthcare executive. I'm a bleeding heart liberal. It was a spirited discussion. And I thought, not long after that Thanksgiving, I'm so grateful we had that experience. I couldn't have known beforehand how important that day would become, what a blessing it would be to me in the days after Jeremy's death and even now. I didn't do it on purpose. Life, God, the universe provided that moment for which I can give thanks. This whole gratitude question reminds me of the Taoist story that I've told here a handful of times. It's one of those stories that I intend to live with all my days and find it more than worthy of repeating. I hope you find it more than worthy of hearing again. It's about an old farmer who had worked his crops for a lot of years. And one day his horse ran away. Upon hearing the news, his neighbors came to visit him with cakes and wine. They were so sorry for him. They knew what a horse meant to him. Such bad luck, they said, and they shook their heads. Such bad luck. But the farmer was cool. Maybe, he replied. The next morning, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 other wild horses. Well, now the neighbors wanted to share in the old farmer's joy, so they came around to his house again with more cakes and more wine. How wonderful, they exclaimed, but the farmer again was cool. Maybe, he replied. The following day, his son tried to ride one of the untamed horses, was thrown and broke his leg. Now he couldn't help out around the farm, and so here come the neighbors again, now surely getting tired of their repeated visits, but here they come to offer their sympathy on his terrible misfortune. We are so sorry, they said. What bad luck. Well, by now you can probably guess the farmer's response. Cool as a cucumber. Maybe, he answered. The day after that, military officials came to the village to draft young men into the army. Seeing that the son's leg was broken, they passed him by. And the neighbors, here they come again, with wine and cakes, congratulating him on how well things had turned out. But the farmer just said, maybe this is good. In this story, the moral is not to look for the good in every tragedy. I get annoyed with that approach. Every cloud does not have a silver lining. Every rose does not have its thorn, etc., etc. What the Taoist master is asking us to remember is that life will always bring us good things and bad things. Every life. Our job is to be carried on by the stream of life in such a way that we don't focus entirely on either bad or good circumstances. Personally, I see this story urging us to live lives of gratitude, but a certain kind of gratitude, a gratitude that is detached from the up and down circumstances of a life that will bring rain and sunshine to each of us. A gratitude that says primarily, I am grateful to be. At the core of my being, I'm grateful to be, and circumstances won't shake that gratitude. In 2007, in the Unitarian Universalist World, our periodical as a denomination, Reverend Galen Gingrich wrote, "My current conviction is that our defining discipline as Unitarian Universalists should be gratitude. In the same way that Judaism is defined by obedience, Christianity by love, and Islam by submission, I believe that Unitarian Universalism should be defined by gratitude. Why gratitude, he asks? Two dimensions of gratitude make it fitting as our defining religious practice. One, he says, has to do with the discipline of gratitude, and the other has to do with an ethic of gratitude. The discipline of gratitude, making sure that we're grateful, practicing it, reminds us how utterly dependent we are on the people and the world around us for everything that matters. From this, he says, flows an ethic of gratitude that obligates us to create a future that justifies an increasing sense of gratitude from the human family as a whole. The ethic of gratitude demands that we nurture the world that nurtures us in return. It is our duty to foster the kind of environment we want to take in and therefore become. End quote. Too often, though, it's easy to be more like Bart Simpson than like Galen Gingrich. In one episode of The Simpsons, Bart offers the following prayer over the Thanksgiving meal. Dear God, we paid for all this food, so thanks for nothing. You may not be surprised that Matt Groening, who created The Simpsons, is a Unitarian Universalist. But I don't know about Bart's prayer. We can plant the seed, but we cannot make it grow. Some of us are temporarily able-bodied, but when our time comes and we can no longer care for ourselves, we will need to rely on others. And we live in the kind of world with the kind of people who will be there when we need them. We can give thanks for this anytime. Gratitude can become a practice for us. So with apologies to the Puritans who fought so nobly against it, I'm glad there's an established national day of Thanksgiving. It doesn't mean we don't have sorrow. It does mean that we acknowledge that the essence of life is good, that life is worth the living. Even when things look bleak, life brings us blessings, and that indeed we are not completely in control. In her 2012 book, Anne Lamott suggests that there are really only three prayers. They form the book's title: Help, Thanks, Wow. The only three prayers you'll ever need. In her chapter on the prayer Thanks, she says, I admit sometimes this position of gratitude can be a bit of a stretch. So many bad things happen in each of our lives. Who knew? When my son Sam was 7 and discovered that he and I would probably not die at exactly the same moment, he began to weep and said, if I had known that, I wouldn't have agreed to be born. This one truth, she says, that the few people you adore will die, is plenty difficult to absorb. But on top of that, someone's brakes fail, or someone pulls the trigger, or snatches the kid, or someone deeply trusted succumbs to temptation, and everything falls apart. We're hurt beyond any reasonable chance of healing. We're haunted by our failures and our mortality, and yet the world keeps on spinning. And in our grief, rage, and fear, a few people keep on loving us and showing up. It's all motion and stasis, change and stagnation. Awful stuff happens, and beautiful stuff. It's all part of the big picture. In the face of everything, we slowly come through. We manage to make new constructs and baskets to hold what remains and what has newly appeared. We come to know or reconnect with something rich and okay about ourselves. And at some point we cast our eyes to the beautiful skies, she concludes, above all the crap we're wallowing in, and we whisper, thank you. If you are in a place of pure celebration this Thanksgiving, blessings. May this holiday season be light and life for you. You are loved. You are connected. And if you're far from that place, if hope and gratitude seem difficult or impossible, If hurt and grief are your companions this year, may you find folks beside you on that hard path. And when the time is right, may thank you find its way to your heart too. You are loved. You are connected. For these truths, we can all give thanks.